Hello and welcome to Chapter 34 of Wheelock's Latin, in which we will be discussing deponent verbs and also ablative with special deponents. The ablative with special deponents. So let's just dive right in here. Deponent verbs. What is a deponent verb? A deponent verb is a special wonky kind of verb that, for whatever reason, only has passive forms. That means you'll never ever conjugate a deponent verb with your active endings like ost mustis und or isti it imis istus erunt. Those endings never appear on deponent verbs. Deponent verbs only appear in the passive. So r ter me mer mini inter, pardon me, or with in a two-word system, like for example, secutus sum, right? So with a form of sum there, or a ram, or a ero, depending on whether the tense of your verb is perfect, pluperfect, or future perfect. They do exist in all of the other moods and tenses, right? So you can have a subjunctive perfect, or you could have an indicative present, or an imperative, right? All of those things exist, participles and infinitives, but only in passive forms. With the exception, you'll note that I have here, the exceptions are the present and future participles and the future infinitive. And that's because those three things, the present and future participles and the future infinitive, do not exist with passive forms. There is no passive form for the present participle, right? There's only a present active participle. So we use the present active participial form even for deponent verbs as well, because there's just no passive to use. Future participles, same thing, right? Urus there's no future passive. Or there is a future passive, but we don't use that. That does its own thing. So we can't use that. Now, they only have passive forms, but deponent verbs always translate as active verbs. Okay, they always translate actively. So a deponent verb has a passive ending, but it translates as active, and there is no way to make a deponent verb translate passively, obviously, because you can't add a second passive ending or make them more passive than passive. There's no way to make a deponent verb translate passively. Okay, with the exception of the, as we see down here, the future passive participle, also known as the gerundive, which we'll get to down the line, which is does translate passively as going to be verbed. Okay, so again, deponent verbs have passive forms but active meanings. And they typically refer to verbs that have a sort of reflexive sense to them, like to wash your own hands, right? Washing or even bathing, right? The idea of bathing is something that you do actively but to oneself. And so that's sort of where the foundation of deponent verbs comes from. They're originally related to a separate voice in ancient Greek. There was the active and the passive, and then a voice called the middle in ancient Greek, which obviously Latin doesn't have, and that's where deponent verbs come from ultimately. But that's not really important for us right now. Just know that they exist. The last little bit of context or sort of construction material for deponent verbs is the fact that they only have three principal parts. Of course, they don't have a perfect active system at all because they can only appear in passive forms. So the third principal part from other verbs does not appear here. So we just basically have first, second, and fourth principal part for deponent verbs. And so we don't leave a space or something. So we just have first, second, and third. Okay. Now, imperatives for deponents are a little bit different just because you haven't really seen passive imperative endings before. So you'll note here I just gave, as a reminder, our non-deponent imperatives for purposes of comparison, and then our deponent imperatives here. And they work the same way. They're still imperative commands. There's a singular imperative and a plural imperative, right? Depending on who you're giving the command to, whether it's one person or more than one person. But the endings are re and mini. Notice that mini looks exactly the same. The plural imperative looks exactly the same as the second person plural indicative. Right? That's just the second person plural passive ending. So, for example, sequimini could be second person plural present indicative, or it could be the plural imperative, and only context will make it clear which one is which. The trickiest bit about the imperatives is that, as I say in the note here, the singular imperative does look an awful lot like a present active infinitive because of course it ends in re, just like amare or laudare. But remember that the present active infinitive doesn't exist for deponent verbs because they don't have active forms. So there is no such thing as a present active infinitive for a deponent verb. So if you see a deponent verb that ends in re, you'll know that that's actually an imperative. Okay? Again, there's no such thing as as a present active infinitive of a deponent verb because there are no active forms. They only have passive forms. All right. And that's really it for deponent verbs. I'm going to hop back real quick. Again, only passive forms, translate actively, they only have three principal parts. And the deponent imperatives, right? Re and mini as the endings. The way that you know a verb is imperative is by looking at its first principal part. Right? An imperative verb, as we looked at in the vocabulary already, a deponent verb, of course, will have a passive ending on its first principal part. So, for example, hortor, sequor, conor, those are all deponent verbs, and you know that by the first principal part. So really, knowing a deponent verb is all about vocabulary and paying attention, memorizing your principal parts, memorizing your vocabulary. That's how you know a verb is deponent. All right, but we also know some verbs that are called semi-deponent. And you've seen some of these already. Audeo, audere is a pretty good example. Not audio, audire, we know that means to hear, but audeo, audere, to dare, right? We learned way back in, I don't remember, chapter 5, chapter 6, something like that in Wheelock. And remember, it's a second conjugation verb. And we remember that it was a little bit weird because its third principal part was not like audivi or something like we'd expect, but instead was ausis sum. And I told you way back then, or your Latin 1 teacher would have told you, don't worry about that. It's not a big deal right now. And it wasn't. But now it is. So when you look at a verb like audeo, audere, ausis sum, you note that it only has three principal parts, just like a normal deponent verb. But the way that that verb works is that the first two principal parts, right, audeo, audere, in the case of our example, are regular non-deponent verbs. It's just a plain old second conjugation verb, conjugates like any other second conjugation verb. So audeo, audes, audet, in the future, audebo, audebis, audebit, and so on. Nothing shocking about that at all. And that's in the present system. That's any form of that verb that's built off of the first two principal parts. But anything that's built off of the third principal part, which of course is also known as the perfect system, that's going to include anything that is perfect, pluperfect, or future perfect, is deponent. And that's where we get ausis sum, right? Which is of course perfect, indicative, first person singular. Ausis sum, I dared. Right? It translates actively, just like a deponent verb, but it is passive in form. Right? Ausis sum is perfect and passive. And so that is a verb that is called semi-deponent because it's deponent sometimes, not all the time, just about half the time, right? Only in the perfect system. Okay. Examples of deponent verbs. Now, the trick to deponent verbs, or one of the tricks of deponent verbs, is that even though they have passive forms, right, because they have to have passive forms being deponent, they still can be transitive. And if we remember, transitive means a verb that has a direct object. So, for example, in our first sentence here, hortati sunt, that's a deponent verb. It's in the perfect tense, right, third person plural, and its subject is they. Right? In this sentence, there's nothing in the nominative, so it's they. So they encouraged, right? But eum, way over here, that's in the accusative case, that's our direct object. So they encouraged him, right? And that might look a little jarring because, of course, you've studied passive verbs long enough to remember that passive verbs never have direct objects because, of course, the action of a passive verb happens to the subject, right? As in, the ball is kicked. That's a passive sentence. And the action of the kicking happens to the subject. So a passive verb never has an accusative direct object. But these verbs, deponent verbs, can be transitive, meaning that even though they look passive, they still have active meaning and can therefore have a direct object. So they encouraged him. And him here being modified by this participle, also of a deponent verb, patior, is a deponent verb. But remember I said that in the present participle form, because there's no such thing as a present passive participle, we use the present active form here. So him in suffering, right? So they encouraged him suffering, and then haik mala is the object of this participle. So they encouraged him suffering these things. Here, in the second sentence, I've just changed the present participle to a future participle. And again, notice it's active here because the future passive participle doesn't exist. So they encouraged him about to suffer these evils, or these evil things. Okay? And then finally we see hortandus est. Here is our future passive participle, which we can't use here because of course the future passive participle means something different than just about to verb, or even about to be verbed. Here of course it appears in a passive paraphrastic, which you remember, I hope, from Latin 2. So this man, there's our demonstrative pronoun, ought to or must be encouraged. And this man having suffered. So here is our deponent verb with a active, again, active sense. Not having been suffered, but having suffered these things. Okay? These evil things, I should say. Okay. Okay, so those are deponent verbs. And then finally we see that the last bit of this chapter is that some special deponent, we call them special deponent verbs, will use an ablative. Right? So a small set of deponent verbs use the ablative case for the direct object rather than the accusative case. And we've already seen sometimes verbs that take different cases like the dative instead of an accusative. But here we see verbs that take the ablative, and there aren't very many that do that. So verbs that use the ablative case for their direct object. And these verbs, they're all deponent, are vescor, potior, utor, fruor, and fungor. And I don't think that all of these appear in the vocabulary. I'll have to go back and look. Utor is by far the most common of these verbs. And they, in order to help us remember them, Miss Williamson often refers to them as the filthy five. I learned them and refer to them as VPUF, right? V-P-U-F-F. VPUF helps us remember these are verbs that take the ablative case. Which is not surprising, given that utor, of course, means to use, and we expect an ablative of instrument, the thing being used, right? So we almost expect an ablative with a verb that means to use, right? The thing you're using is, of course, your ablative of instrument. So if I use a hammer, that hammer will be in the ablative case, not in the accusative case. Okay, and that's it for chapter 34. That's all of the grammar that's involved. If you have any questions, of course, you feel free to ask me in class, or better yet, use Piazza and ask your fellow classmates, and of course, be looking at Piazza so that you can respond. Thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow in class.